All right, well, let's get started. We're talking here today with Catherine Alexander, who's the leader of an extremely interesting organization called Ethical Impact, I think out of Boulder, Colorado. Is that right, Catherine?
Correct, yes.
Yes. So, and Catherine and I have become friends over the last couple of years, and because I want, as I think Two Energy subscribers understand, I want to be able to say the answer is always yes. When somebody comes to Two Green Energy with a question like, "Can you help me understand this technology, or raise capital, or protect uh, intellectual property, or do engineering analysis, or implement, a 10 megawatt solar farm. I want to be able to say, yes, I can help you with that. And certainly, strategies for corporate sustainability is becoming an extremely important subject in our world. And when I realized that, and the people were coming to me, and for instance, there's another organization called GreenBiz that is run by a guy I know. And they have, on their site, they have commonly 250,000 direct corporate sustainability who are coming for information on the subject. And Catherine's website, and she's going to talk a lot about that, offers an enormous amount of content on this, not to mention various types of services. And she's generously consented to take us through some of the kind of high-level thinking that surrounds this notion of corporate sustainability. Catherine, welcome to the break. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Craig, for having me. It's a pleasure.
Okay, well, good. Now, before we get going, let's talk a little. Handle a couple of issues. Number one is audio. I think I've handled the audio, and I think most people listening are doing through computer speakers, and I think that's going to work. If it doesn't, or if it doesn't work with the level of quality that you'd like, please just jot down the phone number and just participate in this thing via conference call, and that would be 218-844-0842 is the phone number, and the passcode is 524329. So, but having said that, let's just move right into this. What I would like to do is just, if you can, I'll just put up your slide here. Catherine, you want to talk a little bit about the organization and its purpose?
Okay, I'd appreciate it. We are in a time of really dramatic change, and there is an old saw that says you can't do the same things over and over and expect different results, and though we do it all the time. So we need to act differently, and that's easy to say and hard to do. So I've worked hard to learn and devise new ways of working together so that we do get different results, and that's sort of the basis of how I work with organizations. And collaboration is key. I do a collaborative strategic planning process to get the collective wisdom about the future. I include stakeholders, not just employees, and that yields the ability for an organization to really get ahead of the pack, and sometimes even their industry. So there's a lot of wisdom that we have available to us that we're not very skilled in tapping. That's a little bit of.
Okay. Well, very good. So why don't we just move right into this? I'll just have a slide here on me, and I appreciate it. I guess I might as well show it as long as I have it on the thing. So hello, everyone. All right, moving along quickly. Here we go.
Okay, I don't want to belabor the issues that we're facing. This is sort of a short reminder of some of the changes that are happening now. We are seeing a dramatic increase in natural disasters of all kinds. And this impacts our availability of resources, it impacts the cost of those resources, and it diverts people's attention, and it impacts people's ability to buy. So it's really important that we start to plan for this and address these issues in a variety of ways. And these slides are from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Program put on by the United Nations Environmental Program. And this slide is about floods, and the next one is about fires. But we also have drought. And the fire data does not include the rate fires that were in Russia last year, which I think would have spiked the Asian figures considerably. The issues are worldwide. The tsunami in Japan impacted chip production, and that impacted computers, cell phones, and every product that used them. So we have really to think about how these kinds of things are going to impact us and begin to strategize before they're really a crisis to deal with it. And we have every indication that these events are going to increase, not just decrease. To get a better understanding of how some of these things might actually relate to where you are and to make them not quite so abstract, there's a software engineer in Royal Oak, Michigan, and has created a website called ifitweremyhome.com. And he's looked at two disasters. One is the BP oil spill, and the other is the Pakistan floods. What you can do is see, he has mapped the size of those two disasters, and you can put it over your hometown, ifitweremyhometown.com, and see what that would look like if it had happened where you live. And that gives you some sense of the scope of some of the things that we're dealing with. So the three questions I would ask you: how are these kinds of situations going to impact your business? How is your business contributing to these situations? And what can your business do to address it?
Okay, so let me understand this, Catherine. So you're suggesting, obviously, that there's an increase in natural disasters, and I guess you're implying that this is because of the impact that mankind is having on this planet, right, so far?
Yes, I don't think we really even need to go in so much into the why. If you know that it is happening, then you had better plan on it. I think we're getting caught up in trying to point fingers instead of dealing with the reality.
Okay, so what you're saying then is that the increase in the number of natural disasters, regardless of how it's caused, is creating the imperative for business to plan for natural disasters or plan on an increased number of them. That sounds more like a logistical than an ethical issue. I'm not trying to say that everything that comes out of your mouth needs to talk about sustainability and ethics and so forth. But so what you're saying is that businesses that want to take seriously the issue of sustainability have to contemplate the fact that there are increasing numbers of natural disasters. Is that right?
At the very least, this is a really strong concern, and it pushes things in so many ways. Traditionally would address these kinds of risks by stockpiling and that kind of stuff. We're not going to have things to stockpile, so we have to look for alternatives, which is why you're in the alternative energy business.
Interesting. Okay. Well, why don't we move on to this next slide? I'm not sure. I hope this is legible at the level of screen size and so forth, but why don't you take us through this one?
Okay, so we're going to look at the light green sort of it's on the left-hand side first, and we're looking at operational issues that impact this volatile kind of market situation. So if we don't do anything, what we can expect to see is higher resource costs, an increased loss in productivity, physical damage and losses which are going to yield an increase in insurance cost. The market impact means that we're going to have supply chain disruptions and products are going to become obsolete very quickly. And from a stakeholder perspective, you're looking at inefficiency, suspicion, and conflict as people fight over what's left. So if we address them, however, and that's the dark green on the right-hand side, then you start to discover that you have other things to utilize so that there are sustainable answers to the current resource issues we have. Labor pools will be much more stable if we actually can provide them work. The structures that we are building will become more resilient. Insurance will not increase because you've managed the risk. And you will cover new markets and an emerging demand. And from a stakeholder perspective, there are huge opportunities for partnerships. a great need for transparency, which is a huge thing we'll talk about later. And licenses to operate will be much easier to come by in those countries that are impacted. So you have to think ahead in order to deal with some of these things. And the thinking ahead is really key because it takes some time to do this. It also takes thinking differently. And that's the next slide.
Okay, well, very good. I'm interested in understanding market opportunities. I think people, when they hear that, they go, "Can you give me an example?" In other words, how would that actually work? So you're thinking ahead, and you're kind of learning from nature. You're doing all of this good stuff. Can you give me an example of how that might open up a new market opportunity?
Yeah, and I think when we get into the examples of the different companies and the things they've done, some of that will become much clearer. But Interface is
Okay,
certainly...
didn't want to derail you, so why don't we just go on? Then go ahead.
Okay, yeah. And I think that's sort of a hidden piece of this, which is why I'm so excited about it, because the WIFMs, the winnings are huge. But you have to start thinking in a way that's going to work the situation and work with how nature does stuff. So when we look at what the ecological laws are, nature has had 3.8 billion years of R&D. So there's proof in the pudding that these things actually work, but we just need to understand what those principles are. So the principles mean success, and they mean a new way of thinking about issues. So the key piece that nature always does, and if you get nothing else out of this talk, this is the key thing to take away, is that life creates the conditions that support life. So business has to do it as well, and we do not think of that. Business takes from life. It doesn't necessarily think about how it contributes back to life. And that life is not only living beings or life forms, soil enhancement, resource use. It's also people, and this is where the ethics start to come in, because people are part of life. We are part of the planet and part of nature. So one of the more germane aspects of this whole shift is the life of the employees in the organization so that they can actually contribute the gifts that they bring. We tend to take from our employees, too. We do not support them in their own growth. We do not evoke from them the best that they offer. We try and beat it out of them often. And that doesn't give you this, it gives you the least.
Okay. Well, I find this very interesting. I do perceive over the last couple of decades probably a gradual increase in the consciousness, to use the word, of business with respect to this. I'm sure it's not happening with the speed with which we would like. But there must be some businesses that are behaving reasonably well around this. I mean, for instance, the whole concept of maternity leave or telecommuting or days or what have you, 30 years ago really didn't exist very well.
Right, and I think Gore-Tex is really one of the most wonderful examples of this. At Gore-Tex, you are hired for your skill. There is no job description. It is up to you to discover a team and to find a project.
Okay.
And that really means people have to own their skill and own their commitment to what they're contributing company, and then the company in turn owns giving them the resources and the capacity to bring their dreams to life.
I see.
So it's a win-win.
Okay, I think we're going to come across some case studies in a second here, and I'm sorry to have kind of put the cart before the horse. So, all right. So anyway, I put up the slide for you.
Okay, so I'm going to just run really quickly through the other three because they're not necessarily really clear. So efficiency, I think we kind of understand, but the key to efficiency from a natural perspective is that there is no waste ever. So that's a huge learning for business. Waste is exactly that. It's a waste of resources, time, money, everything. So if you want to improve your profit, eliminate waste. There is huge amounts of waste. Locality, having things local, being resilient and flexible as things change, being able to learn. These are keys to making things work. And they require, for most organizations, some very deep changes because this is not how most companies function. Let's look at the next slide.
Okay. Let me ask you about this. When you're talking about deep changes, I'll be interested to hear what you say when we get into this thing. So in other words, are you talking about organizational change, philosophic change, change in specific, ad hoc human resource policies? What specifically are you talking about?
The answer is yes.
In other words, all of the above?
Yeah, it's very deep, and it really goes into all sorts of areas. And
Okay.
That's why the timing is so important, to take the steps now that we're going to need later. It takes time to do this stuff. You can't just decide tomorrow that you're going to be different. It doesn't work that way because they are so deep, because they are so profound. I mean,
Okay.
zero waste is just a huge concept to get your head around. I mean, when you start to really look at the kinds of things that we throw away, and that's what these 4 questions are about. So ask yourself, what in your company do you use that is extracted from the earth and that accumulates, that you can't get rid of? When you burn oil, coal, there is a residue, which we're not getting rid of. That's why you're in the green energy business, because that's one of the solutions to that kind of problem. What do we use that's made by humans that is also accumulating? Chemicals, plastics are the key pieces here. Now, it's possible, and we'll talk about this later, through green chemistry to make chemicals and plastics that don't accumulate. But we have to do that. And we have to create those, and they are not all there. See, the solutions don't really exist in some cases. So you have to discover you need that solution, and then you have to create it, which is why the timing is so germane.
Right.
Thomas Kuhn wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and he discovered 3 things that scientists do when they do experiments. Now, the whole point of the scientific process that we're very inured to is that you do an experiment, and that experiment should be replicated by somebody else, and that experiment should say that the theory you had going into that experiment works. So Thomas Kuhn was curious, and the question he asked was, what happens when experiments don't go as planned? And he found that human beings, including scientists and including you and I, have 3 strategies. And tell me if you've run into these. The first is that we distort the data. What we'll say is, oh, well, it doesn't really seem to fit, but what it really means is, and we reinterpret that data to fit the theory that we have or the belief that we have. The second strategy is we discount it. Well, it's not really relevant to us. We're special. We're different. It doesn't really apply here. Okay? But the third strategy is actually more important, and it is much more difficult to address. And that is, if that new experience does not have any history with a person, you've never seen or experienced that result before, it is invisible. You will not remember it. You do not understand it because you're discounting it or distorting it, and it simply will not exist. And I think that's part of what we're kind of change, because it's so outside the norm. It's very hard for people to actually recognize it.
Yes, I see you're breaking up a little bit, Catherine. So, but I think what you're saying is that the third of these, in other words, the fact that when something happens that we completely don't expect, it's almost invisible to us, and that is the point of Kuhn's book, The Structures of the Scientific Revolution. In other words, that we think, paradigms for us are in a way blinders. They They force us to look in certain directions, and they force us not to look in others. So I'm completely with what you're saying on this. Okay, well, very good. Next slide.
Now, 2 more points here.
Okay. Go ahead.
We're looking at the destruction. Now, these 4 questions, by the way, come out of a process called Natural Step, and it's the way that it's a really good way to begin to think about what you as an organization need to do to deal with these 4 issues, which are sort of the heart of the change that we're looking at. So what do you as a company use that results in destruction of nature? So there's timber, there's agricultural, there's medicine. Birth control medicine has been found to create mutations in sea life. Why? Because all the medicine that we take internally goes in one part of us and out another. And when it goes out, it gets into the water system, and then it gets carried out into streams and oceans. And that has impacted sea life. So we're really having to rethink a lot of what we do because we don't look at any impact except on us. And it's a full cycle, so we have to really think about those more deeply. And then the more ethical piece is what things do you do as an organization that really prevents people from achieving a satisfactory life? Now, this could be by ruining the life in rainforests for those people who live there. It could be the issues of methane drilling and fracking as we're trying to get more natural gas. And it could simply mean how do you really support your employees into becoming whole human beings?
Mm-hmm. It's very good.
This is where it gets a little deeper.
Yes, I can see that. Very good.
Let's talk about some of the stories of places where people have really done amazing things. So New Belgium Brewery, if anybody's a beer fan, Fat Tire Beer, they have been very serious about their whole approach to environmental stuff. And they've, it's a very energy-intensive business, this converting plant life into something we can drink. So they really have aggressive goals, and they are incrementally moving toward them. And I think this is really key because we tend to think if we can't do it, that it's beyond our reach. Sustainability is a journey. There is nobody that is totally there. Nobody. I know of no company. I think Interface is probably the most committed, and they actually have a timeline to be carbon neutral, which is probably as good as it's going to get for a long time. But everybody else is in process. So I want you to really appreciate the process, not necessarily the goal. So they've reduced energy by 3% since 2009, and their goal is 25% by 2018.
This is Interface you're talking about?
I'm sorry?
This is Interface you're talking about?
No, this is New Belgium.
Oh, okay. So very good. So, okay. So what they're about, you're saying, is eliminating waste. So can you take us through a little bit about that? I don't, I enjoy beer, but I don't know much about the way it's made, and I certainly would know how to eliminate waste in that process.
Well, they have waste in the material that they brew, and that they turn into animal feed and into compost, which is perfect. And then they have water because they use an awful lot of water. So they've managed to divert 95.6% of their water use. And using water, the intensity of their water use, however, is much more difficult. And they've only been able to reduce that by 2%, and they have a goal of 12%.
Okay.
They are 100% wind-powered, but they have also been able to create power from wastewater and power from solar.
Great.
And they're very transparent. You can get all of this information from their website.
Terrific.
Okay. Now, when we look at Interface, Interface has one of the longest histories. They started in 1994. They have reduced their greenhouse gases by 82%. They've reduced their fossil fuel use by 60%. They've reduced their waste by 66% and their water use by 75%. Now, these people make carpet. Okay, it's pretty prosaic. They're a high-end, international, very small boutique carpet company. But they have invented and patented new machines, new materials, and new manufacturing processes trying to achieve these reductions. And in so doing, they've increased their sales by 66%, doubled their earnings, and raised their profit margins because they've reduced their waste. These are huge numbers.
Yes, they are. Those are impressive. Now, is this the company, by the way, that said, look, the whole concept of selling carpet is intrinsically unsustainable, and we want to change this so that we lease the carpet, and therefore we continue to own it and can figure out what to do with it when its quote unquote owner is finished with it?
Yes, absolutely. Well, the carpet actually is key to the next generation of carpet. It's a raw material, so they really want it back.
Yes. Well, I think this is, in my estimation, speaking of paradigms, this is really a paradigm shift for business. When I heard about this case study a year or so ago, I went, oh my gosh, that's really thinking outside the box. So here, we just naturally think when we make carpet, we sell it through distribution and retail, and it winds up tacked onto somebody's floor, and 10 years later it winds up in a landfill. And these people said, you know what, there's something the matter with that. I can do a better job recycling and reusing and just being more sustainable vis-a-vis that carpet than the guy who owns the house or the hotel. And that's really thinking outside the box in my estimation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's what happens when you start really holding your own feet to the fire and thinking in this kind of way. All of a sudden, new possibilities open up that you just had no idea were there. But you have to go through the process to make that happen. It's not something you can just get. I mean, it really comes because you're struggling with the tension of we need to do this and we need to do that, and you don't capitulate to either side until you get a new idea. So Gore-Tex is another really interesting story. They have 9,000 employees. They're in 30 countries, and they're a $2.5 billion company. Now, most people know Gore through fabric, especially if you're a mountain climber or a hiker or you do anything outdoor stuff. Gore-Tex fabrics are renowned for that. But did you know they also make guitar strings, electronics, and medical supplies, which is where most of their money actually comes from, and that every product they have is based on one polymer. And every product was created by an employee who got an idea, who was then supported in order to make that idea real. So Gore-Tex has been self-generated because their culture and their management style forces people, allows people, evokes from people their own creativity. They don't know what to do. Yes, it's really remarkable. It's very remarkable, and they've been very, very conscious about how to do that. And they have actually moved into creating products to help facilitate a sustainable world. So they have products that capture 99.9% of particulate emissions in certain industries. They've created chemically inert sealants. They do organic waste treatment, and they're working on fuel cell development. These all come from the employees, not from management. They're bottom-driven.
That's terrific.
Cisco is another one. Cisco is sort of a late entry, but sort of a surprising one. They're an IT company, of course, and what they do is make connections in the IT world between things. And they had this epiphany that maybe they should actually use their products. So he's been able, he says he could step down now, and there are 500 people in the company that could take over with no problem. He has developed leaders throughout the organization, and he's creating the same kind of generative culture that W.L. Gore has. They now have, Cisco has 61 new technologies that they've created, mostly around the collaboration possibilities of technology. And they've done that because they've been able to create a collaborative culture. That's one of the things that we are so used to thinking of the leader as the one with the brains, the one who tells everybody what to do, and this turns that all on the head. You're actually being told by your employees what to do. They are the ones that are coming up with the ideas, and leadership becomes facilitative, not directive. It's a very big shift.
I should say, let me just throw in a question here for the audience while we're on the subject before we go to our next slide. And by the way, please feel free to use that. I think I can't see it from here, but I think it says comment or ask questions or whatever. Yes, on the left-hand side of your screen. Please feel free to write these in. Garth Barker says, just as wind, the energy from wind is extracted via wind farms, which is, of course, a good thing. He asks, what are we removing from nature that will come to haunt us later? And I guess that's really what the subject of your last slide. Do you care to comment?
And well, if the caller is referring to wind farms, the issue with wind farms, and the same is true of solar, it's how we make the towers. It's the material in the towers.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the process that we're on, the journey we're on there, is to make those things truly biodegradable, basically. And the same thing is true with solar technology. A lot of those things are very toxic in the process by which they're made, and that is not sustainable. So even though the energy is, the means by which that energy is captured and stored is not. So we have to do in those areas. That's not to say we shouldn't do it. It just means we need to get much better, much quicker at how we create the material that allows us to use that energy.
Right. Very good. Thank you. All right. Here's your next slide.
Okay. So here are some places to look for examples. Biomimicry is truly wonderful, and there's a book by that name by Jeannie Benyus. I'm going to give you only two examples. One is underwater glue. It is really hard to glue things underwater. It is very, very difficult. We're not very good at it. The things that we have created to do that are toxic. They require a lot of heat and energy to make happen, and yet mussels do it every day, and they do it in 3 to 4 minutes. They do it underwater. It happens. It's very easy for them to do. And there's a guy at the University of Delaware named Herb Waite who is working on how to take an understanding of how mussels do this and make products that work the same way. So they would be biodegradable. Styrofoam is one of the part of the way the mussel actually glues is generating a kind of foam that then hardens around whatever it's trying to glue itself to. And so they're creating a biodegradable styrofoam that's compostable based on that kind of technology. Another thing is the sea slug. It's called the Spanish dancer. And sea slugs are brilliant. They're beautiful creatures if you've ever seen one, but they have no shells, and they're very soft-bodied. So those colors tell predators that they're noxious, and they have a capacity to sort of create a kind of poison that is very unappealing to people who would eat it. But that noxious poison also is becoming a basis for an anti-inflammatory drug, and the eggs of the Spanish dancer have a coating on them to prevent them from being eaten, and that coating has antifungal properties, which actually impact tumors in humans. So we're starting to see how nature works and then looking at our own issues and saying, how does nature solve this problem? Let me go find some animal, plant, bacteria, whatever, that's doing this and see how it works. And then we mimic that, and then we get things that are not toxic, that aren't wasteful, that don't require energy to make. And that's where we're going.
That's brilliant. Just before we go on, let me just say that Jeannie Benyus, by the way, I highly recommend her and her work to everyone. And if you want a good introduction to it, you can. It's Benyus, is B-E-N, YUS, if I'm not mistaken, Jeannie Benyus. And if you go to TED.com and look at her fantastic TED talk that she gave a couple of years ago, I promise you that will be 14 or 15 minutes of your life that will be extremely well spent. That's just a brilliant expression of this. And I guess the highlight of this thing to me is just the distinction. We've been learning about nature for millennia. This is not learning about nature, it's learning from nature. It's saying, nature's had, close to 4 billion years to figure out how to solve problems and has done it extraordinarily well if we can simply open up our eyes and our minds to this. So,
Absolutely.
okay, well, very good. Next slide, fire away.
Okay, so leadership, I think, is really key to this because we have to move our companies forward in some kind of way. And that's traditionally been the leadership responsibility. But these changes are much more than 2 eyes and 1 brain can do. And there really isn't any time to waste. So leadership needs to create context to allow things to happen. And that needs a new understanding of how things really work, like green chemistry and biomimicry. And it needs to be, leaders need to be able to think ecologically, to understand systems, because the entire organization has to participate. Now, this has sort of been a holy grail for leaders for some time, that everybody contributes. And when I talk to leaders, they grouse that people don't understand, they just don't get it, they don't know how important things are. No, they don't, and they don't because they're not told, they're not trained, they're not educated. That's absolutely correct. So that has to change. And you have to have everybody involved to do this because it is so complex, because there are so many pieces and parts. And people just have insights. Everyone has a different way of looking at things, and you need that diversity. You need that difference in order to solve some of these problems. So you have to experiment, you have to play, you have to try things. Instead of working to just do it right the first time, you don't know what right looks like until you've played with it long enough to see that it does actually work. And we have very little tolerance for that in a lot of companies. Also, the sense of ambiguity of we really don't know is very hard for some leaders to manage. So you have to be trusting of your employees, and you can only trust them if they care. And that's where values and having things meaningful really makes a difference. One of the real gifts of sustainability is that it is a very meaningful approach. If it's done strategically, people jump on this because they love the planet, they love nature, they really like to feel that they're helping out. And sustainability does all those things for employees if you really let them grab onto it. So it really is a wonderful way of involving people, and the energy that's released is tremendous, but you have to allow that to happen. You can't force it in the way we traditionally do. It just doesn't work that way.
Great. Before we go to our next slide, someone writes in here, how do we know that removing energy from wind doesn't have a long-term climate effect? Let me handle that one if I may. Not that I'm an expert in wind, but what I would say is this. I have made something of a study of this whole subject of the environmental impact of renewables. Insofar as Catherine said not too long ago, there is certainly we are replacing one form of generating energy that has environmental impact with another that also has environmental impact. The issue that I would provide here is that I think we need to deploy, and I don't want to be condescending about this question and from the audience here, but I think we need to deploy what I would just refer to as common sense. It's true that, for instance, birds and to a greater degree bats are negatively impacted by wind turbines. Having said that, 800 times more birds are killed every day from cars, and 1,200 times more birds every day are killed from flying into plate glass windows. And the guy I interviewed for my first book on renewables, Renewable Energy Facts and Fantasies, on the wind subject, who's the chief scientist at Clipper Wind, who's been at this thing for decades, I asked him about this at the end, and to be honest with you, he was at a certain point in this interview, he was almost in tears. He goes, "Look, when you take Google Earth and you fly over West Virginia, you see that they've elected, instead of putting wind turbines on the top of those mountains, they've elected to chop the tops off them to get and burn the coal." He goes, "If you can understand that, if you can make sense of that, good luck." So I think, not to be condescending to the audience question on that, but I'm not saying that there's no damage associated with what we're trying to do with respect to renewables, but I think that common sense indicates that what the environmental impact of something like taking the energy out of the wind is far less deleterious than burning coal, which produces 49% of our electricity here in the United States, and spewing most of that garbage into our atmosphere, which is not only damaging, it's causing $250 billion a year in lung damage, not to mention ocean acidification and so forth and so on. So I think, again, we have to just kind of look at the most obvious facts here and move forward boldly. So next slide, okay, Catherine?
Yeah, I would like to make a comment, too, on mountaintop removal, because I think it's a really good example. If we went back to those 4 questions, what are you extracting that accumulates? What are you doing that's destructive? What is man-made that's accumulating? It's all there in mountaintop removal. Every one of those things, destroying the ability of people to live. When they dump that material into the watershed and fill up the streams that run down the mountainside, they are impacting towns. Towns have been destroyed because of it. The people who live there, their health has been destroyed because of it. So it's a really good example of all those 4 questions in one place.
Good point.
So thinking differently, sustainable intelligence, understanding systems thinking, understanding how all of these things are connected and how those impacts flow, and then not doing that. Starting to act using ecological thinking, how nature would do it. How does nature use things for one species but not destroy another? That's not to say that there's not death in nature. Of course there is, and that death is actually integral to the whole life process. That's a whole other topic. But everything that nature does create the conditions that support life. Everything. That's why we've had life on this planet for 3.8 billion years, and that's why it's increasing in its complexity. We are the only thing that's impacting that. Now, the American Indians have lived on this continent for 30,000 years. We've been here for 200. What can I say?
Right.
Leadership is measured by followers, not by what the leader does, but by what followers do. So if you want a culture where people are contributing, are generative, then you might want to look at how many people volunteer to do things in the organization that are outside of their job description, and how many departments within a company actually help each other instead of just working on their own numbers. If they don't start thinking about the whole, which is systems thinking, instead of just thinking about their own particular needs, each department, you're never going to get there. You have to have that interdependence. You have to have that ability to really see everybody as part of the whole, and everybody is equally valuable. And the sustainable values are one of the pieces that I've put together to help companies be able to make decisions on a consistent basis around this. So one of the values is life creates the conditions that support life. You want to think about that when you're making decisions. How can you increase your diversity? Not eliminate it, not be homogeneous, but increase the diversity and really utilize the gifts that that diversity brings. If you can't do that, you will not be resilient. Diversity is the keystone that makes resilience possible. And right relationship is another value. Right relationship from leader to employee, from employee to employee, from employee to customer, from employee to environment. Right relationship. What makes a win-win for everybody that's involved in that relationship? to optimize things instead of maximize. This is a really big key. We don't make everything work well. We make very specific small pieces work well, which is maximizing. So we'll maximize a department, and that will actually undercut the ability of the whole company to be effective. So it's optimization, not maximization. And allowing for self-organization, and this is where ambiguity and trust really come into play. People will do whatever they need to do if they have the information that allows them to make good decisions. If they don't have that information, they cannot act. And we withhold information and then kvetch because people don't know, don't understand, and don't do. But the information has to be available so they can act on their own, and they self-organize. I mean, you see this in any disaster. It's not that somebody swoops in and says, now we'll do this. People rise to the occasion and can see what they can do and what they can contribute, and they do it. So we manage to do this at certain times, and then we get, put our own foot in our mouths in other times. Now we really have to learn to be very conscious about this. I think leaders are not born, they are made. They can be coached, educated, and mentored into being leadership. But the goal of leadership is to create other leaders.
Fantastic. This next slide is just a way in which folks can contact you and sign up, I believe, for your newsletter.
Yep.
Correct? And
they can get these slides if they'd like to. Just go to that URL. And they would sign up for the newsletter at that time, but certainly the slides are free and they are available. So we'd love to have you do that. I'm also engaged in a research project to try and determine how values really impact management style. So if people are interested in being part of that, just let me know. That would be great.
Well, fantastic. Well, this has been wonderful. And the URL generally for you is Ethical Impact. How does it go?
ethicalimpact.com.
Okay, good. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, Catherine, fantastic. I certainly appreciate you being on the program. It was a joy speaking with you. I hope this was informative for our listeners. I will have this webinar archived in the next few days. Of course, I always say that, and it always takes longer than I think, but fairly shortly. And again, thanks for everybody for participating, and I'll talk to you again soon. Signing off now.
Craig.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Bye now.